Hi everyone, welcome. I'm glad that all of you are here to join us today for our Charleston Conference webinar series. Our topic today is Born Accessible, How to Make Publications Accessible from the Start. I'm Leah Hines, Executive Director of the Charleston Library Conference. And just before we get started, I have a few technical tips on how to use the Zoom platform. And of course, as I'm giving you technical tips, I'm having technical difficulties here. So I apologize for that. Let me get my slides back on the screen. Don't you just love technology? There we go. So our topic today, we're going to be joining through the Zoom platform, and the best audio quality is going to be if you use your computer speakers. There's also an option to connect by telephone if you're having any issues, or you can send me a question on the attendee chat and I'll try to help troubleshoot any tech problems that you may have. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a little icon here that says raise your hand. You can raise and lower your hand there, and I'll also be able to see if you have a question. But really the best way to reach me is through that attendee chat. We're going to save questions for our presenters till the end, so you can use the Q&A icon. If you click that, a text box will come up. You can input your question and comments there and click send, and we'll hold those until the end of the presentation. There's also some options up here for full screen or original size if you want to make the screen larger or smaller. While people are getting connected and getting settled here, I'm going to do a quick poll. We're interested in what type of attendee are you? Are you a librarian, a publisher, vendor, consultant, student, or other? And this is multiple choice, so there are library publishers out there. If you fill more than one role, you can select more than one. But again, if there's something that's other in the other category, we would ask that you let us know in that attendee chat. You can also just use the chat to say hello, say your name, where you're from. You can say hello to one another if you see another attendee that you recognize. I'll leave the poll open for just a few more minutes and then I'll share the results. Right now it's looking about 65% librarians, 34% publisher, 1% vendor. We have a few students and a few others. Looks like things are slowing down there with the poll. I'll give it another second, but if you answered other, let us know in the attendee chat what that other role might be. We're curious. So there's the results. You can see 65% librarians, 34% publisher, 1% vendor, 3% student, and 6% others. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. And now I'm going to introduce our speakers that are here with us today. Bill Kasdorf is principal of Kasdorf and Associates, LLC, a publishing consultancy that focuses on accessibility, XML, HTML, EPUB modeling, information infrastructure, standards and best practices alignment, and editorial and production workflows. He is a founding partner of Publishing Technology Partners. Bill is active in the W3C, serving on the Publishing Working Group, Publishing Business Group, and the EPUB 3 Publishing and Knowledge Domains Community Groups. He also co-chairs NISO's Video and Audio Metadata Guidelines Working Group. Hi, Bill. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Also joining us is Jonathan McGlone. Jonathan is a front-end developer and senior associate librarian at the University of Michigan Library since 2012 and has worked at the intersections of academic libraries, digital publishing, design, and the web since 2007. Most recently, he's actively involved with the development of Fulcrum, a Mellon Foundation-funded open-source digital publishing platform for scholarly publishers that launched in 2016. Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for being here.
Hi.
Also with Jonathan is Jillian Downey. She is Director of Publishing Production for the University of Michigan Press within Michigan Publishing and the University of Michigan Library. Jillian has worked in publishing for almost 30 years, more than 20 of them at Michigan Publishing in Ann Arbor. She's worn many hats across manuscript, editorial, design, and production. So thank you for joining us, Jillian. Hi.
Thanks, glad to be here.
All right, and with that, I am going to turn over the mic to Bill, who's going to be our first speaker. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bill, and I'll let you load your slides and take it away from here.
Okay, thanks a lot, Leah. Let's see, there we go. First of all, I'm really glad to see the makeup of the group today, the attendee group, because, so first of all, I should confirm that you're all seeing my screen properly. Leah?
Sorry, I had muted my microphone. Yep, the screen looks good. Thank you.
Great. Obviously, these Charleston events tend to be mostly attended by folks from the library world. And so there's actually more publishers on the call than we thought there might be. But we wanted to stress that this isn't just for publishers, because for librarians that are acquiring content, it's really important for you to understand that getting accessible content, well, first of all, you should be paying attention to that. And I think we're seeing increasingly that librarians are, in fact, becoming more attentive to getting accessible content, but also that it's getting increasingly easy to get accessible content. And that's because more and more content is born accessible, which is what the point of this webinar is. I am accused of making accessibility sound too easy, so I'm going to try not to do that. I'm accused by particularly the technical people that are on working groups that I'm on, saying, Bill, don't say it's a piece of cake. It's not a piece of cake. My role here today, other than moderating, is to just give you some background about the kind of the standards, the expectations, the file formats that are used for accessibility today, and why it is, in fact, much easier than it was even just a few years ago. But the bulk of the webinar will be by John and Jillian, who are at the University of Michigan and who are actually doing this. So they provide the truth from the trenches part of the presentation. And no, not everything is totally easy, but I'm here to tell you that there are many, many publishers that are, in fact, making accessible content and making it routinely available. And one other thing I'd like to just say by way of introduction is that accessibility is not binary. It's not that something either is accessible or isn't accessible. It's a matter of how accessible is it and accessible for whom. So don't just assume that a file that you get, a digital version of a publication, is inaccessible unless it meets all the criteria that I'm going to lay out here today. Getting partially accessible is way better than getting not accessible, and that's one reason why EPUB has become so important. So let me just get going on the presentation itself. The reality is, despite my sunny introduction, is that most publications are inaccessible, or at least not accessible enough. And so what happens is that, they get acquired by libraries, they get acquired by students, et cetera, and then they need to be remediated. And people are often horrified to find out how much work is actually being done behind the scenes to fix publications for particularly students in higher ed, which is the focus the area that I usually work in, scholarly and higher ed, to add accessibility to content that they get that isn't accessible. But one reason that this is quite a shame is that making the publications accessible just plain makes them better. They're easier to read and navigate by anybody. They've got a good logical structure, good reading order. You can access them on various devices. They adapt to various devices. You can use read aloud when you need your hands free or your eyes on the road. Actually, a publication that is really made accessible in a proper way is actually easier to consume and easier to understand. And this is an example of the accessibility world improving our world in general. Curb cuts, for example, originated for accessibility. But now, you know I travel a lot in my work, and I can't, it's such a hassle if there's a curb cut when I'm walking to my hotel with a heavy suitcase, or people with a stroller with kids, etc. Closed captioning that you take for granted in noisy locations. Maybe I'm a little obsessed with my travel, but airports are the example that flashes into my mind. Okay, bars. I don't hang out in bars, but there's another example. Voice assistants, they've become ubiquitous. All of those things are things that the technologies that they're based on originated for accessibility, and now they're just in general use for everybody. And that's what we want accessibility to be for publications. To have them just born accessible, we take for granted that they're born accessible. What do we mean by born accessible? Well, it means that instead of having a publication being made the traditional way that it is right now, and then somebody later has to fix it, or that publisher has to use a special workflow or special formats to make them accessible. Instead, a truly born accessible workflow and born accessible publications just use the standard workflows that a publisher uses in general. And the resulting publications that way are accessible from the start. The standard publications, the same publication that everybody gets, is accessible to somebody who needs to use assistive technology. So that's fundamentally what the vision is for born accessible. We have Betsy Bowman from Benetech to thank for coining that term, and it's a very compelling concept. But people figure, well, gee, that sounds like a lot of work, and it probably adds a lot of cost, and I don't have much bandwidth, and I don't have much money. Well, many publishers are much closer than they realize, and particularly, I speak a lot to scholarly publishers, and scholarly publishers really don't realize how close they are to having good accessible content. The reason for that is that the standards have come to align with most of the standards that publishers use anyway. So the fundamental basis for accessibility worldwide is really what's called the Open Web Platform. Web standards, the two main ones are what's called WCAG, which is not just for publications, that's for any web content in general. That's a real foundation for accessibility. And then there's another standard, also a W3C standard called ARIA, which is a way to add semantics to content or to publications, either websites or publications, to provide semantics that help assistive technology work. And today, pretty much all standards and guidelines and requirements worldwide, the EU, Asia, the US, et cetera, have all converged on WCAG as the foundation for accessibility. Many of you maybe are familiar with the term Section 508. There was what's called a Section 508 refresh done just a couple years ago that brought it into alignment with WCAG. So instead of a lot of different requirements in different regions, more and more, if you make your content accessible for the US market, you're also making it accessible for other markets as well. One reason for that is that the file formats are the ones we're already using anyway. One of the leading groups in accessibility worldwide is called the DAISY Consortium. And for many years, they were promulgating a format which is called DAISY, but in terms of that kind of XML markup under the hood, it was a specialized markup scheme called DTBook. A few years ago, when EPUB 3 came out, they basically abandoned their specification and said, no, from now on, EPUB 3 is the right format for interchanging accessible publications. And of course, many of you probably know that EPUB 3 is based on the Open Web Platform. And so we're talking about standard EPUB 3, not some kind of specialized accessible version of EPUB 3. Ideally, again, getting back to this born accessible concept, the same one everybody can buy and markup that publishers and vendors routinely use. The main semantic markup, the structural semantics for headings and paragraphs and sections and things like that is HTML5. I mentioned ARIA which augments it for web accessibility. And then there's an additional group of, additional set of terms called EPUB ARIA. Basically, it augmented the existing ARIA markup to provide things that are publication specific. A lot of people don't realize that HTML doesn't actually have a concept of a chapter or a footnote. Well, this is a way where you can identify this is a chapter, this is a footnote. And so all of this is now really fundamental to HTML. In fact, I shouldn't even be using the term HTML5. I should be just saying HTML. That's HTML. And standard EPUB 3 also means that it aligns with EPUB Accessibility 1.0. That's an accessibility recommendation. Again, it's available through the W3C, and it specifies what EPUB features you should have to ensure that they're accessible. It needs proper navigation and structure so that assistive technology can find particular things. It can go straight to chapter 5, for example, without requiring the user to just literally plow through the entire content. It can go to a particular page. It can skip the footnotes, for example, etc. All of that, it depends on this markup, and all assistive technology works based on the same markup. And then one nice thing that isn't as common yet, but is getting more common, is accessibility metadata that describes how accessible the publication is. And when we developed this accessibility metadata, which is in that EPUB Accessibility 1.0 spec, it was done in collaboration with schema.org. So the identical accessibility metadata is a specification of both schema.org and EPUB Accessibility 1.0, which is W3C. And then there's always this issue of, well, how do I know if I've got this right? Well, there's a lot of help there too. I've been involved with the BISG Book Industry Study Group for many years, and we've developed what's called the BISG Guide to Accessible Publishing. Really huge. It came out a little over a year ago in a new edition that's like over 100 pages. Don't get overwhelmed by that, because it's designed to be a reference. It's online, and it explains a lot in very non-technical terms, and directs you to just literally hundreds and hundreds of useful places and resources. Another really important and useful resource is Daisy's Accessible Publishing Knowledge Base, really comprehensive and a very dynamic reference. A group called Benetech has one of their units is called the Diagram Center, and they provide really excellent training, examples, resources, etc. So they've got a training materials for helping people develop good image descriptions, creating good math that's accessible math, etc. And the Describing Visual Resources Toolkit, actually we have our friends at Michigan to thank for that. They basically, they're a, well, I won't steal their thunder, but they're mainly a humanities and social science publisher. And the Benetech image description training is pretty much focused on science and scientific content and technical content more than it is humanities content. So basically what Michigan did is adapted that and brought out really excellent guidelines for humanities and social science publishers. So all of those, by the way, I'm providing links to all of this stuff at the end of my presentation. And then finally, to just test how things are, Daisy has a free facility called Ace by Daisy that basically you just upload your EPUB. And in fact, they just a few weeks ago actually brought out a desktop version. So I've actually got Ace on my laptop. It's available for Windows and Mac. And it just provides a really comprehensive analysis of an EPUB to tell you basically what's missing, how accessible it is, what things still need attention, etc. That's automated. And it's true that a lot of things about accessibility need some human intervention. For example, just saying that the alt text attribute is present isn't enough. That doesn't tell you if your image description is actually a good one or not. So there's another facility called SMART that really helps facilitate that human review and generating report. I have to mention that that is available currently just to Daisy members and partners. And then Benetech also has a program they're working with both vendors and publishers, I believe including Michigan is working with them, to basically get their workflows certified that they are producing accessible publications. Macmillan Learning was the first one to get that certification. And so that can reassure, a university or a library that publications coming from that publisher should be properly accessible. So as I mentioned, there's just a lot of useful resources out there. I've got 2 pages of them listed here in my at the end of my slides, and these slides will be available. And so at this point, I'll be happy to turn this over to John and Jillian, and they will tell you what was involved for them to actually get accessibility implemented at Michigan.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Bill, for that introduction. Everyone can see my slides and hear us okay?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Yeah, so just I want to say thanks again to you, Bill, and to Leah and Charleston Conference people for having us here. And we're very excited to share with you today how the University of Michigan Press has approached making accessible books, from both our high-level policy decisions that we've made to more detailed aspects of what it takes to actually produce accessible ebook products. Leah provided some introduction to Jillian and myself earlier, and so I guess we can sort of skip this, but if you'd like to, we've put a little visual here so you know who's talking to you. Just wanted to give you a little overview of what it is that we'll be talking about today. We wanted to cover some background on the press and why we started our Born Accessible initiatives, and look at how our program has developed over the last 4 years, and talk about some of the bigger decisions and strategies that we've employed to help move our initiative along. And I think this should be helpful for those of you making ebooks in library publishing programs or scholarly publishers looking to produce consistent and accessible books. But know, that, no 2 publishers are always alike. So, what we're providing here is just how we've implemented it. It's not a true blueprint, I think. But, we're always happy to talk with other publishers and other folks who are interested in sort of doing similar things that we're doing here around accessibility. And we're also going to look today at what makes an ebook accessible. Bill sort of gave a nice overview of that. We're going to focus on EPUB format specifically and the concepts here, but I think the concepts about what makes an EPUB accessible really, hopefully, we can transfer that to thinking about making all different kinds of digital content accessible. So some really sort of core concepts around digital accessibility. And I think this should be helpful for those of you who are making born digital content or evaluating born digital content. So the librarians who are attending here who might be evaluating content that you might purchase for your library patrons. And I think some of the concepts could be transferable for books, websites, or journal articles for that matter. So along the way, we're just going to try and share real stories of how these concepts and policies have played out in working with editors, authors, our production staff, vendors, and readers. Because Bill is right, it does take work, and it is a very, very collaborative process for a publisher to be producing accessible content. So I just want to give a little context of who we are and where Jillian and I work. Michigan Publishing is a division of the University of Michigan Library, so we're situated within the University of Michigan Library. And within Michigan Publishing, we have 3 units. The University of Michigan Press, which is a traditional scholarly monograph publisher. We've been doing that since 1930. And we produce about 100 books a year in digital and print, primarily in the social sciences and the humanities. And we're really going to be focusing on University of Michigan Press specifically, But these other two units, publishing services, they serve faculty and students here on campus. So it's a campus-based publishing services outfit, kind of like a lot of library publishers are. And then we also have Deep Blue, which is our set of institutional repositories that are part of Michigan Publishing. So it is our mission at Michigan Publishing to be an accessible organization. And, but like I said, and each of these units are doing their own efforts around accessibility, but we're going to be really just focusing on the press today. So I wanted to start our story out with a real story about a real person who kind of led us to where we are today. And that person, and this is going back now to 2015 in July, where Stephen Kusisto, a blind professor of disability studies and literature at Syracuse University, wrote a blog post documenting problems that he encountered with our ebooks, the University of Michigan Press's ebooks, and ironically, it was a disability studies ebook. And I wanted to read a portion of his blog post because it documents a real user experience, and I think that's incredibly important. And two, it typifies the struggle of a blind researcher who is trying to do just their day-to-day work and the kind of roadblocks they might encounter when they need accessible content. So Stephen wrote back in 2015, "One way blindness remains grim concerns the ongoing and considerable difficulty of acquiring accessible books. As a blind scholar, I must say this is my Mount Everest. Getting a hold of books I can read is not only difficult, it's often nearly impossible." And then he kind of goes on to detail in much detail his experience of trying various technologies with our to get our ebooks to work with his assistive technology, and then kind of concludes by saying, "I find it ironic that a press which publishes books on disability and culture has so little expertise in making its scholarly publications easy to read for blind researchers, but they are not alone. Try reading online journals or downloading articles from major academic websites. You will find it's a jungle out there." My own theory about this is that higher education still treats disability as a mandated form of service provision. Accordingly, they see it only as a student affairs issue. True accessibility is seldom imagined as an important facet of knowledge delivery. And so Stephen, not only did this uncover, that the press had been neglecting our ebook products, but it also that we were making it confusing for our users with print disabilities on which products to purchase and how to use them and how for those to work with their assistive technologies. And this really kicked us into high gear, and we got to work almost immediately after Stephen posted that. And it's important to know that we didn't change everything at once. And that would have been, doomed our project to fail, I think. Instead, we focused on starting small and learning what worked and didn't work and what needed to change in our workflows, and what could stay the same. And from that experience, apply that to the whole of our production workflow. So the first thing that we did was just audit our existing EPUBs and see, what accessibility work we needed to do with our ebooks. But we also adopted EPUB as our primary ebook format. Before that, it was PDFs, and that sort of made us change how we talked about our ebook products on our website and things like that. What we found when we did our audit was that we really were lacking in image descriptions, and so we adopted a Born Accessible workflow, which I'll talk about a little bit more, and piloted that with just our disability series, disability studies titles. And that series is about 8 to 10 books a year. So it was small enough that we could learn from that process and then apply to the whole, as I mentioned earlier. And one of the things in focusing on getting image descriptions and getting them from authors, which Jillian will talk about more, was that we really needed to develop guidelines and educational materials for authors to help them learn how to describe images. So we did it wasn't really until 2018 that we were comfortable enough to sort of extending what we learned from the disability studies titles to the rest of our titles, you know, the 80 or 90 other titles that we produce a year. And so we're going to talk a little bit more in detail some of these things of how we're that are underlined here, these sort of higher level decisions that we made. So the first thing we did was develop a born accessible workflow. As I mentioned, after we conducted an audit, we found one large gap was the lack of image descriptions. And so we could have said, well, we'll write all the image descriptions in-house or have a vendor do that at the end. But really what we wanted was the image descriptions to be an integral part of our bookmaking process. And I think that's really important. So, so that it would become just another part of what goes into making a great book. And the reason that we focused on getting them from authors was description, like the rest of the text, it has to be in line with the standards of scholarly writing. And who best to do that but the author themselves, who know why they selected that image and how to describe that image in context of the rest of their argument in their book. So to support these kinds of changes, we modified the guidelines that we developed for our authors. And this is something also important to consider, you know, that what you share with your authors, it needs to include these kinds of changes, right? So we included now explicit discussion that we will require alt text from an author, and give them resources and examples and help them along the way. And you can feel free to look at our guide, and the link is there on the slide, and sort of see how we've implemented that. But this really is one of the ways of starting that conversation, of having the editor start that conversation with the author. And to support this, we learned that describing images in an equitable way, right, so that there's a full textual replacement for that image, it's not easy, especially for authors who are new to that process of writing image description. And so Bill mentioned that, you know, Benetech's Diagram Center has done a great job for the sciences. There wasn't really anything that existed for humanities and social sciences. So, you know, how do you describe a painting effectively? How do you describe a portrait photograph or a sculpture? So with funding from the Press Foundation and our accessibility here at the library, Stephanie Rosen, we assembled a group of leaders in museums and archives and libraries and digital accessibility and publishing to come up with this toolkit, which has examples. It has all kinds of information for different types of audiences, for authors, editors, publishers, and organizations, glossaries, and the sort of foundational information too that you can use to sort of have these conversations about image description with various people that you're involved with when publishing a book. So one of the things that we also did was and what publishers need to do is follow a specification. So we chose EPUB 3 as ours, and we went a little bit further and developed a sort of house style specification that extended the EPUB 3 to be very explicit about the kinds of HTML and markup that would be put into our EPUBs. And so we also added onto this, into the specification, all kinds of information about accessibility features that need to be included in EPUBs. And so this is sort of crucial for ensuring consistency across the books that we produce. But it's also something that we can share with vendors who might be responsible for putting the content together for us. And this has been made available publicly There's a link in the bottom of the slide. It's posted on GitHub. And so I'd encourage other publishers or people interested in this, or might want to reuse some of the patterns that are in there, because there are explicit examples of different types of HTML markup to use for different types of content, like images and figures and tables and that sort of thing, to check that out. And then finally, I mentioned we're with the spec that we're striving for consistency. We know that that's really just an ideal. Not everything we get from an author is going to be the same, and not all authors may actually help us write image descriptions. They may not. We may ask them to do it, but they may not actually provide them, and that has been the case. There might be other constraints or differences with the content that might lead us to make different decisions. So based on time or resources or funding or other challenges with the content that we get from book to book. So we created three tiers of accessible EPUBs and sort of set a baseline, as you see in the very top here, of what we were not willing to go under. And you see I've highlighted here the image column, and then our baseline is that all of our books would have some form of alt text in them. And this could be very simple or basic alt text. So in a case where an author does not provide images to us, we might work with a vendor or in-house write very basic descriptions so that someone using assistive technology would know that, oh, there's an image here and it's a chart and the title of it is this title. That's obviously not, the ideal. And so our standard really is this middle one where the image has a text equivalent. And that's what we want to be aiming for. So we did this so that we could then track the different levels for the books that we're producing, but also communicate across production and acquisitions and across the organization when we're talking about a specific project and the level of accessibility that a certain book would be getting. So with that in mind, that's some of the high-level decisions that we made. And next we're going to take a look at the parts that make up an accessible ebook. And Jillian's going to take over and talk about images, I think.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Thanks for listening in. And John and I are going to switch back and forth a little bit here as we go. But I will start with this basic diagram of the elements of image description. So this shows the visible and the hidden elements of a page with body text, an image, and a caption. On the right, it lists the hidden elements of alt text and long description, which are read out loud using assistive technology. So the alt text, short for alternative text, is usually pretty short. There's slight variations here, but I've seen suggestions for aiming for 120 to 140 characters or fewer. And the long description is longer. It goes into more detail, but how much detail it has to go into probably depends on how much the image is described in your text already. The long description can have multiple paragraphs, and it can have other elements inside of it, such as an extract or a table, which might be needed for an image that is a graph or a chart. So this next slide is a sample where you can see the image and the caption below it on the left, and on the right is a view of the HTML coding from the EPUB with the alt text, caption, and long description. Just to give a bit of a feel for it, the alt text is up above in bold, the photograph of Ransom Notes campaign billboard. The caption you can see in the middle and also underneath that image as well. But it's the long description towards the bottom in the bold text on the right that goes into a lot more detail about what the sighted reader is actually seeing. This image is of a towering billboard. The text on the billboard appears composed of words and letters cut out from a variety of different print sources and pasted together. The text reads, 12 million kids are held hostage by a psychiatric disorder. So this really gives a feel for the difference between alt text and long description. So now to go into more detail of our experiences with alt text and front cover description. As John mentioned, we find the highest quality alt text starts with the author, and it starts really early in the process. Our authors know their content the best. They can most accurately describe their art. And so we really do ask our authors to write their own image descriptions. To give one small example of why, on one of our theater books, we needed alt text somewhat last minute. So we were trying to write it in-house, and we described a photograph in that text as a man standing in an exaggerated pose, arms outstretched. But when we showed that description to the author, they said no, that the man was actually dancing. So even basic alt text can be a bit harder to do than it seems like it will be at first glance. And we are working with our authors quite early in their manuscript development on this, so that so the authors know they need to really work the images into their text and into the points that they are making. They should talk about why the images are important in the regular text. And when they do so, the image description usually occurs naturally. And sometimes when they're working on this, the authors realize that the art is not really that integral to the argument or does not really add much to it, and it would be better to just remove it. So both of these things, the better integration of the images and removing non-essential images, make for better books overall. And for quality reasons, in most cases, we require the image description to be with the rest of the manuscript when the project moves from our acquisitions department into our production department. So that way the image descriptions can be copy edited along with the captions and the rest of the text, so everything is consistent, which is helpful. So this is an ongoing process where there's a lot of education, as John mentioned, to encourage and support our authors in doing this. Written guidelines and especially links to concrete examples in their field seem to be the most helpful to authors. And you do, in reality, have to plan on doing some of this work in-house or with vendors too, at least for a while. Realistically, sometimes an author just is not able to write their image descriptions or misunderstands what is wanted. So sometimes we do write them in-house, our acquiring editors or editorial associates, and sometimes we need to pay a vendor to write the descriptions. And as mentioned, you should plan in the time and cost to copy edit them. And there's also the front cover description. For some of our covers, once the cover has been designed, we work with the author to write a cover description for the copyright page. And our authors are usually pretty involved in providing us with cover art in the first place, so they're familiar with the art. So this is an example of a recent cover design and cover description. So the description on the right includes all the text on the cover, but then it really goes into describing the visual aspects in a pretty eloquent manner, actually. To read it for a moment. And it really provides a pretty rich experience to someone who can't see the cover, and might even make someone who can see the cover go back and give it a second look. So now I'll switch over to John, who's going to talk more about the reading experience.
Right. So another aspect of an accessible book would, and this really can be applied to not just EPUB, but any sort of accessible digital content, is having a logical reading order within that content. So the examples that you're looking at here on the left, you see this is a page from a printed version of Coed's Ruining the Nation by Julia Bullock, one of our titles. And on the right is the EPUB version. And you know, sighted readers don't typically think about the logical reading order within a chapter of a book, really because they can visually identify what secondary content is on that page and read around it as desired. So a reading system really doesn't have this information to use for the same effect unless you either add it to the digital version of the book, the EPUB, or adjust how the content is laid out in the digital version. So with this example, think of a machine reading through a book, moving left to right on a page. And if you consider the image on the left, so this is this printed version. On the previous page, it's sort of in mid-paragraph and then goes to the next page, and then there's an image. And so it would have been reading a paragraph and then all of a sudden been interrupted and start to read a figure and reading the description of the image, and then not really clear when it gets back into the paragraph. So you see not what was intended by Kamiyama, right? So in the digital version, we've moved the image actually to the end of that paragraph. And so that when a screen reader is going through that content, it's not actually interrupting the flow. It's a sort of natural pause. End of paragraph, read the image description, read the caption, and then continuing on to the next paragraph. So when you're designing digital layout, you don't want to interrupt that flow and you want to place the captions in a logical place. And more complex print book layouts might use things like call-out boxes or sidebars. And these two, if not carefully thought out and marked up with something like in HTML, you would use an aside tag, they can cause issues with screen readers. So it's still possible to maintain complex visual layouts and have them be compatible with screen readers, but it's just worth noting that an extra effort must be taken to encode the reading order or encode the content so that a machine knows what the logical reading order of that content is. So something else to consider in designing an accessible ebook is having multiple points of access. And one thing to think about is including a list of tables and figures with links to those tables or figures. And it's a great tool for not just someone who uses assistive technology or a print disabled user, but also good for sighted users as well to be able to quickly navigate to tables or figures or other content. So another example might be a subject index at the end of a book. Trying to provide sort of similar methods of access that a sighted user would have, especially if you're considering a print book, right? Something that's also very important with all digital content and making it accessible is to ensure that your digital document, an ebook, a web page, has a document outline. You can think of the outline as a list of headings on a page or in a book. And listing out a document outline is one of the first things that assistive technology users do on a web page or document to help them to get an understanding of what they are interacting with. They don't have the ability to scan a page with their eye and sort of see what is there and what they might want to focus on. And so they really benefit from semantically encoded outlines and proper usage of headings. So in the example here, we have an H1 as the title of this chapter, and H2, H3, and even H4s underneath the H3 on the right-hand side of that screenshot. And so if someone who only cared about, say, phase B1, construction of the house, they could listen to an outline of the page and then quickly jump to that section. So you want to be consistent in your use of headings throughout a book too. So as someone's going from chapter to chapter, they might sort of get a rhythm or a feel for how headings are used in a book, and you want to be sure that you consistently use them across a book.
All right, so I'm going to jump back in and talk a little bit about page markers and page navigation. I'm aware, well, I'll try to speed up a little here because we're moving, we don't have that much time left. Okay, so page markers, they're a little faint on your screen there because they're in gray, but we've circled them in red. We added page markers into the text of the EPUB that match the print book. And this is for citation purposes, so it makes sense to us to have them be visible rather than invisible, so all readers can use them. And there's also page navigation, another way for EPUB readers to access any part of the EPUB that they want to. I'm using that page list that you can see on the left there. We're clicking on one of those pages, will take them to that part of the EPUB. And then a couple more elements we haven't talked much about yet. One is tables. We try to make our tables live, meaning HTML coded text instead of images in our EPUBs whenever possible. In order to do that, it can require some early stages work between departments here and with authors, just as for alt text, so that the tables are created in a way that is the most conducive to them being live HTML in the EPUB. So one example is our acquiring editors have to create a financial working for each potential project showing all the expenses involved. In that working, they have to put in a certain amount of cost for each table, but the working was not detailed enough to have different costs for different sizes of tables, only for the number of tables. So the acquiring editor was actually incentivized to have fewer tables. They were trying to reduce costs by encouraging authors to have fewer larger tables rather than a higher number of smaller tables. But in the world of EPUBs, that's the opposite of what we want. Large tables are much harder to keep as live text. So we just had to have that conversation internally so we all understood that smaller tables are better, more tables is better than fewer larger tables. And also written guidelines for authors are really helpful about table design. Some authors really like to use gray shading, for example, that has some kind of meaning in their tables, but that really doesn't work in the HTML coded EPUB table. The table has to be created from the start in such a way that shading is not necessary. And the same with any other kind of visual element. If an author wants to paste a tiny picture into a table, for example, they have to learn early on from the publisher that that content just needs to be reimagined and worked into the text in some other way than a table. And a last detail on tables, it's important to pay attention of the level of detail of your coding of the table. For example, row headings often don't get the kind of specific coding they need in order to be read out loud correctly and be recognized as a row heading. And then there's math. So single level equations like this first one are generally not a problem. They're still fonts, font characters, not images, so they can be read out loud. But multi-level equations like this lower one are currently images in our EPUBs due to the limitations of what ebook vendors and e-reader devices can handle. This is hopefully going to change soon. We may be able to use a math format called MathML, which Bill can tell you more about if there are questions. I'll switch back over to John.
Yeah, so Bill had mentioned in his overview about accessibility metadata. I think we're short on time, so I won't go into much detail, but just really to say accessibility metadata really is a crucial part of all of this. I mean, what good is it if we do all this hard work to make our ebooks accessible and then nobody knows that there are accessibility features in these EPUBs? And so the EPUB 1.0 spec requires these 4 points, and there's a link on this slide to if you'd like to read about these metadata fields in more detail. But really the idea is that for us in the future is that when this metadata is in our EPUBs, that we can use that metadata in our platform, Fulcrum, to display certain accessibility information about a book on a sort of title or product page. So people would know if there's long descriptions in the book or if there's any insufficient problems with the content. And then as we think about ebooks as a primary output now for scholarly materials, it's inevitable that scholars will want to include things like video and audio in their books. And we're already starting to do this with some of our titles at the University of Michigan Press on our Fulcrum platform. And so it's just important to consider that this content too needs to be made accessible and requires a significant effort to make them accessible. So for example, videos require 2 elements. They require captions, which those would be used for the deaf and hard of hearing, but they also require audio descriptions for the visually impaired. And you can think of audio descriptions as something like the equivalent of the alt text for an image, where an audio description is describing the visual content of the video. Oftentimes you see them incorporated as audio tracks where in the video itself. So there might be some dialogue and then a pause where there's a description of the visual content in the video. They can also be text transcripts or text versions of the description of the video. And then just to say with audio, it's also a requirement of WCAG that a transcript be provided alongside audio content as well. It might be worth noting, you know, we've mostly worked with vendors at the press for getting this sort of transcripts and captioning done, and that a considerable amount of work was still required on our end to copy edit and clean up those transcripts or captions that when they were provided to us. And so a lot of the vendors and services out there that help with this really don't have the same sort of publishing quality that a scholarly publisher would expect. So we often found things like typos, place names, or other things were misspelled. And so just to keep in mind that a lot of the vendor work that you might get will probably require work on your end. So that is all that Jillian and I had. There's still looks like a few minutes left to do a Q&A, but thank you all for listening and tuning in. And of course, our emails are on this page, and there might be another email sent out to attendees, but please do feel free to get in touch with us if you have questions or would like to learn more. So I will stop sharing. I think I've just done that.
Yes, thank you very much, Jonathan, Jillian, and Bill. I know we are getting close to the end of our time here, so if people have to go, we do understand, but we'll try to get through some questions. This session is being recorded, so the video will be made available. We'll be emailing the link out to everyone who registered, so you'll get that, and you can catch the Q&A on the recording if you're not able to stick around and listen and participate. But we do have some questions that have been sent in, so let's just jump right in. What has been done to communicate to the wider campus community, for example, at Michigan, about these accessibility efforts?
Yeah, so we're involved with some of the, there's a web accessibility working group, and I'm involved with that, and I've shared the work that we've done with that group. And there's a group within the library itself, a digital accessibility team that I'm also a part of, and regularly updating them on the work that we're doing. It should be noted that Michigan is one of the last Big Ten institutions to adopt a web accessibility policy across the entire campus, and which it's in the works, it's in process, and so I'd imagine once that happens, there may be more interest in the work that we're doing and the things that we're thinking about, and more opportunities for us. Jillian, do you have anything to add? Or?
I guess that's right. I think some of the group from that group are going to be involved in a pilot study, I believe, related to the University of Michigan's, adopting standards.
Right. We are involved with a pilot of the digital accessibility policy at University of Michigan, and so we're giving them feedback, and they're using us and a couple other units within the library as a sort of test case. So what does it take for an organization to implement accessible initiatives? What are the resources involved? What's the timeline look like? Those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Another question, what is the ballpark cost to hire a vendor to write alt text for backlist content?
Okay, so this is Jillian. I would say about why don't we have some really rough costs? About $2 an image for alt text, whereas the enriched long description can be $7 to $9 an image, in my experience.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Let's see here. This is it's kind of a long question. I see that you are marking up long descriptions with ARIA described by, have you tested that across browsers, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, across screen readers such as JAWS, NVDA, VoiceOver, across ebook platforms such as VitalSource, RedShelf, across devices and operating systems? How well supported, and I'm sorry if I'm saying this wrong, is ARIA-described by? If it's not universally supported, then which user environments does UMichigan support?
Yeah, so we're testing it primarily in our platform, and doing it with NVDA and Firefox and VoiceOver and Safari. And the example that Jillian shared is really, it's an older example. We've been thinking about actually no longer sort of hiding the long description like it is right now, and actually just potentially displaying it. So there's all, so that even visual readers would be able to see the long description. And there's sort of discussion in the EPUB and publishing community about the different techniques in implementing a long description. And so that's just one way that we've done that, and it has worked when we've tested it, like I said, with NVDA and Firefox on our platform. But we generally don't test our books across other reading systems. We feel like that would be just, I mean, there's so much difference between from reading system to reading system and what technology works with them. It's really, that work is done by the DAISY Consortium and epubtest.org, which Bill might be able to talk more about that. But that's really where to go to see what reading systems are compatible with what assistive technologies.
Yeah, I can add a couple of things to that. That was actually an excellent explanation, Jonathan. But the Benetech and the DAISY Consortium are right now collaborating on developing and testing an ideal best practice for how to tag extended descriptions. It's the recommendation is basically done, and they're in the midst of doing the testing right now. So you should pretty soon get published. They don't want to publish it until they've done that kind of thorough testing that this questioner was actually looking for. So, and then that's going to be generally available to everybody. One technique that I think is likely to rise to the top, there is an element in HTML called details that's associated with an image. And one thing that's useful about that details element, I've recommended that to a number of my clients, and it's worked quite successfully in the EPUB or online. A sighted user will see the image, and they'll see a little button called details. And if they click on that button, then the content of details will open up. The reason you might have noticed that I used the term extended description instead of long description, there was an element, well, there still is, they're considering deprecating this element called long description or long desc. That wasn't the actual description. That was a link to where you could find the description. The virtue of using this details element is that you can put an arbitrary amount of markup in that element. So it's looking like a pretty useful technique.
Great, thank you. Here's a comment. I think it's often not emphasized enough how accessibility efforts benefit not only users with physical challenges, but also those with learning or cognitive difficulties. Any comments on that?
Well, I'll make a quick comment on that. That's an excellent point that I should have made at the very beginning. A couple of statistics that really drive that home is people usually think of this work as being done to benefit blind people, which of course it does. But there are an order of magnitude more low vision people than there are blind people. And they need different kinds of accommodations. They need to be able to enlarge and reflow. That's one reason why EPUB is so much more useful for accessibility than PDF. And there also are 10 times as many dyslexic people than blind people, and they need yet a different kind of accommodations. They need to be able to change word spacing and line spacing, and there are special fonts for dyslexics. Absolutely, there are a whole host of, there are many, many more people that need this accessibility than people tend to think.
And again, those are things that EPUB format supports, the line spacing, changing of fonts and that sort of thing, and changing background colors and those sorts of things, if the reading system builds in those sorts of features. Yeah.
Absolutely. Color contrast is a problem that a lot of websites have that people just aren't aware of. It's kind of fashionable to have these lovely subtle colors. I did an accessibility review for a major publisher last year, and they have just a gorgeous website, but they had tons of color contrast issues where there's tiny type in a kind of a light blue on a light gray background.
Mm-hmm. Good
luck with that if you're low vision.
That's something that we've tried to stress to our presenters for the Charleston conference. We have a link for some resources for slides, color contrast in particular, for people, attendees, to be able to read slides during the presentation at the conference. So thank you for that.
And that's a good example, again, Leah, of when you do that, it's actually better for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just for the people needing special attention.
I agree. Another question: have you worked with foreign language texts?
Do you want to take this one? Yes, we have. Yeah.
Are you thinking of the videos?
Well, I'm thinking of specifically ones that it's primarily in English, but it has bits of.
We have smaller pieces of many different foreign languages in our text.
Yeah.
Right. It's generally not that difficult anymore. I mean, there are Unicode fonts that have these characters that we can have in the EPUB. Our biggest challenge lately with foreign language was just around audio, a multi-language video, and creating the transcripts for that was our biggest challenge.
One thing with language changes where it's English and then it might change, I think in this example that we're talking about, to Korean, is needing to encode that a language change has actually occurred. So again, so assistive technology would then notice that, and if that has a library supporting that language, would be able to read that.
Actually, one other challenge that we still have, I don't have a good answer to it, is some of our books will have small amounts of text that has to be read from right to left, and we don't have an easy way to deal with that right now.
All right, thank you. Here's a question from Stephen. Some aggregators, I think, still need PDF for library use. What do you do about PDF?
Well, I guess I'll take that one. Most PDFs are, people think PDFs are accessible. Most are not. Certainly, you want a text-based PDF, not an image-based PDF, which is totally unacceptable. I happen to work on trying to create an accessible version of the Mueller report, because the version that was put out by the DOJ was literally badly scanned images of paper. So it was as inaccessible as it could possibly be. But even when you have text-based PDFs, they're typically missing the tagging that provides structure, that directs assistive technology to a proper reading order. And I will tell you that Acrobat does in fact have the ability to assess the accessibility of an EPUB. It produces a really nice report. It's built into maybe Acrobat Pro, but it's built. It's part of the standard tool set provided by Acrobat. So where a PDF will never be as accessible as a good accessible EPUB in terms of letting you change fonts and reflowing and changing line length and all those kinds of manipulations that you could do in an EPUB that you can't do with a PDF. You can definitely make a PDF more accessible. And the standard there is called PDF UA. I don't think I provided a link to PDF UA, but you can search for that and it'll give you the link to how to make a PDF more accessible, including things like the image descriptions, etc.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
In my experience, remediating a PDF at least, yeah. And even when we've tried it out of InDesign, and following InDesign's best practices, say for in our workflow, it's still required work in Acrobat to make the PDF accessible, or pass those checks in the accessibility report.
That's why we emphasize for so many publishers that make PDFs and EPUBs routinely, focus your attention on the EPUB for the accessibility. Although I will say that there are folks, I'm doing a lot of work with Mellon-funded project, working with what are called DSOs, Disability Services Offices in major universities. They spend a lot of time remediating PDFs for students.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask a question out of order here. This one just came in on the heels of what we were just talking about. Has anyone been able to do significant PDF remediation with anything other than Acrobat DC?
I don't know any other.
Yeah, I don't know of the remediation in terms of the born accessible. There are ways to get those PDFs more accessible from the get-go. So one technology that I'm familiar with is called Typify. It's actually a plug-in to InDesign. It's a very sophisticated program, but it's basically built. It's an XML-based publishing, rendering, production software, but they can actually produce very good accessible PDFs using a tool like that. But it's an expensive tool that not everybody has.
Okay.
I do know that even in like Microsoft Word, following guidelines that Microsoft has for creating accessible documents creates a pretty accessible PDF when you export into PDF. So
that's a really good point, and stay tuned for even being able to get accessible EPUBs out of Word files. I'm not sure I was supposed to say that publicly, but there you go.
You heard it here, folks. All right, thank you. A question from Krista. What is the reasoning behind making EPUBs DRM free?
Yeah, so that was a decision we made, and having more to do with accessibility issues with our DRM. The DRM versions needed to be read in Adobe Digital Editions, and there are significant sort of issues with Adobe Digital Editions and assistive technology, which is one of the things that I didn't go into, but Stephen Cusisto was complaining about in his post. And so by making them DRM free, we remove the sort of need to have to require Adobe Digital Editions to read that EPUB content. And so it could be read in essentially any EPUB reader or reading system.
And another point is that most assistive technology needs to get DRM free to be able to access your file and do its work. But I would stress that that doesn't mean that that the EPUB isn't born accessible in the first place. In other words, it can still be the same EPUB that's given out to everybody else. It's just that to a user that needs assistive technology, if there's DRM, it needs to be removed for the AT to work. The DRM is often put on by the retailer. You know, Amazon puts on its DRM, Apple puts on its DRM, etc. The EPUBs that are sent by the publisher to those places typically don't have DRM.
Okay, thank you. A question from Kimberly, are there any resources you can point to for creating accessible, complex charts and graphs? I stumbled over that a little bit. Let me reread that. Are there any resources you can point to for creating accessible, complex charts and graphs?
Basically, what I would suggest is a file format called SVG. SVG is an XML-based image format. And there are accessibility tools that will provide a tactile representation of a chart or graph to a blind person, for example. It's not like Braille. They're actually getting things like the axes, the labels, the values in a chart and graph, and it's because all that content in that SVG image is XML.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on that?
The resource that I don't know about complex, how complex the examples are, but one of the resources Bill shared, the Diagram Center, has some examples, good examples of making accessible graphs and charts and tables. There is an example, I'm looking at it right now, of a complex table.
Okay, thank you. A question, can we be provided with the link to slide accessibility information as well, please? Is that a link that was in the slides, or I'm not?
Well, all of the links that I put on those last two slides of my presentation, those are all live links.
Okay.
I don't know if they're asking maybe something about making slides accessible.
Oh, maybe for the conference, what I mentioned. Yes, I would be happy to share that. Yes, the Charleston conference link for slide presenters. I will, yes, I'll get that and I will make that available as well. Actually, I can do that maybe while you're addressing the next question here. We didn't really discuss more complex media, but I'm interested in videos as well. How is Michigan dealing with this? Subtitles, captioning, etc.?
Yeah, I touched on it just a little bit. We have a few titles that have video, and as Jillian mentioned, unfortunately they've been very complicated videos where there's multiple languages, and so we've had to get translations and multiple versions of captions and transcripts and things like that for the videos. And we've primarily been working with vendors to have those created. There is a hope that authors, if possible, and have the time and have the technical skills, would be able to potentially create captions themselves, or they would work with a contract with a vendor to get captions created for their videos, much like we require them to pay for the indexes that get created for their books. So
there's an organization called NCAM, it's at WGBH in Boston, that provides, and for some reason I'm blanking on the name of it, but if you go to NCAM, which is the National Center for Accessible Media, they provide a captioning tool that is really easy to use. It's very slick and it's freely available.
Yeah, that's actually, I didn't know about that, Bill. So because that is a huge problem that we've had, where maybe an author wants to do it, but it's hard and time consuming without a fancy tool to generate the caption, to stop the video, enter what's input, and then have the time code automatically generated.
That's what this tool from NCAM does. It's
cool.
It's definitely easy enough for an author to use. I apologize. I didn't realize you didn't know about that, or I'd have told you about that long ago.
Well, now we know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I put the slide or the link to the Charleston Conference speaker information page in the chat there, and there's a link there for accessibility guidelines. So I hope that answered the question. Let's see here. There's another comment here. I think this was about something we mentioned earlier. Elise says, Common Look PDF Validator is a proprietary remediation tool if it's of interest to anyone. And I can put that link also in the chat here. She provided a link to that.
I will say thank you for that attendee, because I was not aware of that tool. Thanks.
Let me drop that over here. Give me just a second. It won't let me copy and paste, so I'll have to type it out. I think we have addressed all of the questions that were sent through the Q&A button there. Let me make sure that I've got this link typed out correctly, and I believe that's it. Common Look PDF Validator. There were a couple of comments that came through in the chat above from David, and he asked a question about some tags for chapter titles. Jonathan and Jillian and Bill, are you able to see that question from David Dial in the chat? It says, do you use, and I don't know how to read out the tag there, it's an H exclamation point, tags for chapter titles.
Is that in the chat?
Yes, it's in the attendee chat to the panelists.
He says H1, and then he says tags for chapter titles H1. So really that's up to you. That's how we do it in our EPUBs, because each chapter is its own HTML document, and by accessibility standards, there must be an H1 on every HTML page. So we use that for the chapter titles. Yes.
Okay.
Long way of saying that.
I explained why.
And there was a comment from Jacqueline to the panelists. Our campus has Read and Write Gold software, which allows you to scan a PDF file and save it back as a Word document that you can then make accessible and save again as an accessible PDF. So that's another tool. I'm going to copy and paste that into just the general chat so that all the attendees can see that. Read, Write, and Gold software, or Read and Write Gold software, sorry. I believe that's all the questions and comments that we have there, though. If you have anything else, you can drop us an email. The contact information was included in the slides. We'll put that again when we email information out to everyone. Thanks to everyone who stuck around for the Q&A session. I know we did run over time a little bit, so I appreciate that. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you, Bill, Jonathan, and Jillian. This was fascinating. I learned a lot.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Absolutely. Pleased to do it.
Again, I'll email everybody with the link once the recording's available, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Other than that, we will see you back next time for the next Charleston Conference webinar. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.